On the night of June 26th, 1928, a 17-year-old girl in Oakland, California called the police and told them the maid had killed the baby. Then she took a death poem that she had written for the child, put it in her mouth and swallowed it, and when the police arrived, she smiled and introduced herself as the maid. Her name was Ernestine Janoschek. Everyone called her Erna.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups, we're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem, digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Post-Mortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just exmo curious, this really is the right place. We are here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the culty stuff hiding in plain sight. I am your host, Hannah.
And I'm Jess.
Okay, Jess, today we are doing something a little bit different, and I am telling you a sweet bedtime story, and you can just sit back and relax and contribute as you see fit. You know nothing about this story, so hopefully you will find it as wildly entertaining as I did. So I am going to talk to you about Erna Janoschek, the young lady who called the police and declared that she had just killed the baby that she was in charge of. But before I do that, let me talk to you about the family that she came from. Her dad, Edward Janoschek, was a native of Germany and converted in Germany at the age of 26. And he was really into his new religion, so much so that he served in multiple missions. Edward Janoschek had married a convert who had immigrated from England, Marie Worthing, and they married in Salt Lake City in 1905, and their first daughter, Grace, was born the same year. But at this time, he received a mission call to move his young family to Los Angeles. So that was where they went, and they did move a fair bit around these various locations around the West Coast, with Marie being the breadwinner for the family. She took various teaching positions wherever they went. So cut to April 2nd, 1911, when they're living in California, and Marie gives birth to their second daughter, Ernestine Janoschek, and everybody calls her Erna, E-R-N-A. Okay, so what we know about the home that she grew up in is that Edward and Marie valued education highly, not just academic success. The girls were academically successful, both Grace and Erna, but they wanted their children to be proficient in all the literary arts, and it seems like writing especially was important to Edward. I mean, he wasn't author with his books. He at one point was the editor of the New Era magazine. Not the New Era magazine as we know it, but it was a precursor to that. It was a pro-polygamy at the time when, polygamy had technically been revoked. And then there was a period of time where it was still fully being practiced, and then they got serious about it and was like, no, for real, guys, we do have to stop this. And Edward was, he was so diehard, and frankly, I don't blame him. He had already served at least 3 missions to the church at this point. I mean, you should see the letters that he wrote to the first presidency, talking to them about his conflict between wanting to get married, but also wanting to go and serve yet another mission. So he, in 1904, these are all in the church records. There was a letter that he wrote explaining why he hadn't fulfilled his obligation to serve a mission yet. And it's so carefully worded and deferential. He's like, I'm prepared to accept a mission call, but there's one obstacle. I plan to get married, and he'd thought about whether to carefully, should he go on his mission first and marry afterward? He says, no, I got to get married first and then go on a mission. Not
Why that order?
What an excellent question.
That's
Yes, but-
opposite of what they're doing now, right?
right? So he says, I've decided to marry first. And it wasn't because marriage mattered the most to him. It's because he said at age 39, he felt like his chances of finding a wife would be, quote, decidedly in his disfavor, close quote, after another 2.5 years abroad. Right? So he's like, I'm just being practical. He said he was, quote, perfectly willing to leave it to the authorities to decide his case as they may see fit. But he was proposing that
Get
be
married
allowed.
first,
Yes,
leave her at home with babies, and then go. That sounds
Yeah.
like a grand plan.
right, exactly. So the letter was written to George Reynolds, who was the secretary of the first presidency at that time. And there's a handwritten response at the top of the letter that says, GR, George Reynolds, let him get married if he desires. I give him 1 year together. So presumably this is from a member of the first presidency.
Wow.
Isn't that nice?
So generous. Give them 1 year together and then send him back out. Where you think the church would be counseling him instead to nurture your family relationship, build a strong family that can support both, your church callings, but the, multiplication and replenishing of children on the earth for the church. But no, we're gonna give him a year, send him back out.
Yeah. Once you start, like, if you delve into some of these old newspaper accounts, it's just so common that it provides a foundation for what comes next, honestly, in this story. This is not incidental, I think, to Erna's life. Okay, so Edward married as he planned at age 39, or, he was given permission by the first presidency to marry. At 39, he's allowed to make his own decisions. He wrote a book called The Latter-day Zion, Its Redemption and Chosen Instruments. You can find that online. He served as an editor for the pro-polygamy publication called The New Era. This is the one I was telling you about. So this one is The New Era. Again, it's all archived on the Internet Archive, a periodical dedicated to the interest of Zion and her cause. So the census listed his occupation as a magazine salesman and Maria's as a teacher. And for the next decade, the family moved wherever the church required, California, Utah, back again, before they settled in Oakland in 1920. At some point, Edward abandoned his family in California and went back to Salt Lake City.
Well, he didn't have a problem leaving them to go serve all the mission things. So I guess moving back to Salt Lake City without them was no biggie.
Yeah, because he had more work to be engaged in there. And actually the work
More important work with the church than being a father. And
Yes.
Okay.
Because it was at this point that he was involved in editing The New Era. And it was also at this point that a lot of people were getting upset with John A. Witso for land transactions around Temple Square. And people thought the church was being shady in their dealings, if you can imagine. The details are immaterial to this story because Edward Janoschek publicly opposed what they were doing and publicly called out these financial dealings that he and others thought were underhanded. And so he was excommunicated officially.
After all of that work
Yes.
and all of those years of service,
Yeah.
don't criticize anything we're doing. You're out.
Yeah. In 1930, after
Actually,
all
kind
these
of
missions.
that tradition has carried forward with the church, right?
Exactly. We'll take what you have to give, and when we've bled you dry, if you dare to criticize what we're doing,
Yeah, John
you have
Dehlin
no
might have
place.
something to say about that, right?
Right, exactly. You have no room to criticize the leaders, even if it's true. So that's the thanks that Edward got. And we know that after he was excommunicated, he experienced like some mental illness, it could only be assumed, and he was wandering around essentially roaming the Western United States. Okay, so he abandoned his family in California and went back to Salt Lake City. When Erna was 17 and in the papers for killing a baby, a reporter asked, "What about your father? Where's he?" And she said that she thought he was in Salt Lake City, but she wasn't sure. So that's how we know the status of their family arrangements. I first heard about this case on the podcast called LA Not So Confidential, which is hosted by two forensic psychologists who no longer record the podcast, but all the old episodes are up. And this episode is called Erna Janoschek, Baby Killer. It's episode 151 of their podcast. We'll link to it. Of course, it was a huge resource for me. It was the first place I found out about this story. And they specifically highlighted, because Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh, the host of the podcast, are forensic psychologists who evaluate criminals and make recommendations in court cases and look at family systems and the systems that shape us and how our families sort of help inform how we'll turn out. The point is, Maria was left as a single mother of two girls. So Maria told Grace and Erna what she'd learned the hard way. She said, you can't rely on your spouse to hold you down, basically. You have to work really hard. She so emphasized that you've got to have careers and build stable lives so that you're not relying on someone else. I mean, yeah. Talk about learning that the hard way.
That was her lived experience, yeah.
Right. She got married to someone who immediately, they had a child together, and then he immediately went on a mission, and it's like, even if he took his family with him places,
he's not home. He's not
available.
Contributing to the household. He's not.
Because she was working as a teacher to hold them down financially. So Grace, the oldest daughter, graduated from high school in 1923 and enrolled at UC Berkeley, which is pretty admirable. She was apparently like a whiz academically. And so was Erna, as you will see later from her writing. You will see that her writing is so exceptional, in my opinion. And I have read a lot of undergraduate essays, and if 1% of my undergraduate students had ever written with a fraction of that talent, I would have been bowled over. Anyway, so Erna's 17, Grace is in college, and apparently, according to all accounts, Erna had always been very vivacious and what we might call sort of attention-seeking. She was beautiful and articulate. As I said, she clearly had a talent for writing. Whether or not she had that from her dad, I don't know, because I haven't read his. Her teachers at University High School in Los Angeles adored her and said that she was the kind of student that you remember. But her teachers and her family also said that in the spring of 1928, they did notice a change. She'd always been outgoing and vibrant, and then she became withdrawn and sullen, quite noticeably to the people around her. And when people inquired and asked if something had happened, she just said, no, she just preferred her own company for now. So you've raised 17-year-olds, could be something or it could be nothing.
They can be quite moody. Yes.
Right.
Quite a challenge.
This is just difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if
you
you
just
had
don't know.
one daughter as her mom, you're like, well, it is what it is. This is a teenage girl, right? I mean, these days, I think we would flag it as like, wait, is there depression? Is there something else going on? But in 1928? No, it's just, these are teenage girl antics, and we'll leave it at that.
Or you used to be happy and now you're down, you're blue, you're sad. What made you sad? Nothing. It's just how I feel right now. Okay. And as I said, it could be something, it could be nothing. Well, it turns out with Erna, it was something. And the people around her, they described later the symptoms that would eventually result in a serious, impending mental health crisis. But before that happened, in June of 1928, Erna answered an advertisement for a live-in nanny position. Her mum apparently wasn't super eager for her to go out and get a job. It meant her not going to college, which had been like the expectation. But she let her go because Erna had been so changed. And I think she thought that the work would help, it's a change, it might help her. So the family that she went to work for were the Liliencrantzes. Dr. Eric Liliencrantz was a physician, and his wife, Tice, was a well-connected socialite in the Bay Area. And apparently the family had a good reputation, and Erna would be safe there. She had her own sleeping quarters. And in the Liliencrantz household, as a parent, I imagine you would not have any qualms about your child's safety. Dr. Liliencrantz and his wife, Tice, together, the two of them had 2 children, not trying to make it so that one has more child than the other. They had Francora, who was 3, and baby Tice Diana, who was named after her mother, who was 2. They were, by all accounts, typical toddlers, energetic, affectionate, occasionally exhausting, as you can imagine. To go from 17 and probably not having much experience with children to suddenly being responsible for not just managing a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old, but also you're supposed to be keeping the house situation under control. So as the weeks went on, apparently there were some cracks, and between the needs of the children and the relentless housework and feeling the occasional criticism from Mrs. Liliencrantz, Erna's patience began to wear thin. And we know this because we have it in her own hand. We know Erna broke things. She had accidents, right? She wasn't a professional housekeeper with years of experience. Francora was a typical toddler, but a little bit extra. I mean, Francora had her own, behaviors, let's say. She had tantrums. There was clearly a little bit of rivalry for the girl's affection between Mrs. Liliencrantz and Erna in terms of, who Francora would be fine, and then her mother would walk in the room and suddenly she'd start wailing as if Erna had done something to her. And, this is Erna's telling, right? She sees the child as manipulative. I mean, that's how I read that. But as we go on, I want to hear what you think. So it does seem clear that Erna received criticism as a real indictment, right, on her whole self. She did not receive feedback well, let's say.
Well, after being such an academic scholar, that probably makes sense, right? She's used to praise and accolades for things that she has a talent around, and now this is something new, and receiving negative feedback is going to take a toll, especially on a 17-year-old girl.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. She's likely highly accomplished, and you would be used to doing things well.
I can do everything well. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you can't.
Exactly. So on the LA Confidential podcast, the hosts, who again are forensic psychologists, so I do weight what they say through that lens, they were the ones who noted it was like, well, maybe Mrs. Liliencrantz, through Erna's description, might have been a little bit jealous of how quickly the children bonded with Erna. Okay, and so whether or not that is accurate, that was Erna's reading of the household, that the children had bonded with her, and then that was a threat to Mrs. Liliencrantz, or Mrs. Liliencrantz was jealous of the children's affection. So on June 25th, the Liliencrantzes had Dr. Liliencrantz's parents over to dinner. So you've got the in-laws coming over. They stayed for dinner until at least 8:30, and Erna was given the task of cleaning up. You know what? I will let her describe it, because she wrote a detailed account of the preceding 48 hours from her jail cell. And as I said, she speaks with a voice that I can't improve on. So these are Erna's own words. It was not until Sunday evening, June 24th, that I frankly told myself that I was growing dissatisfied with my work. She's had enough. Okay, but sorry. Dr. Liliencrantz Sr. and wife were over to dinner that night, and as is often the case, when there were guests, the meal was delayed to a late hour. It was fully 8:30 before the table was entirely deserted. I emitted a sigh as I regarded the endless stacks of dirty dishes and greasy pots and pans. The entire day had been a strenuous one, beginning with the baby's cry to be dressed at 5:00 a.m. to the prodigious task awaiting me. Of course, I would have to jag my finger a couple of times on the new carving knife. Although neither of the cuts were at all serious, it took at least 10 minutes' time from my work to stop the blood. As a culminating hindrance and annoyance, I discovered that the stove tray was thickly laden with burned strawberry jam. Mrs. Liliencrantz, I now recall, had made some preserves late that afternoon, and apparently it had escaped her attention once or twice and boiled over. Well, I scoured and scraped with all diligence for at least a quarter of an hour before the stuff yielded to my efforts. So much for detail, but I might relate that it was fully 10:30 before the kitchen was in order and the stove tray could boast complete cleanliness. Hannah interjecting here that apparently her parents were quite fastidious.
Sounds like it.
Yeah, in terms of, so, that's to be considered again in terms of upbringing, mental illness factors. Erna says, the Sunday morning paper was awaiting me on the stairs when I retired to my room that Sunday night. Intending to scan the paper over, I threw myself on the bed, but the first page was never turned. It was 2:30 before the glare of the electric light interfered with my sound slumbers and aroused me to consciousness. I recovered from my somnolence sufficiently to switch off the lights, undress, and get into bed instead of on top. Then, in another instance, insensibility had caught me again. Little Titi, and that's Thais Diane, the 1-year-old, was as regular as the clock in her awakening. By 5 a.m. she was cooing, by 5:30 she was crying, and by 5:45 I was dressing her. Pretty little puss, who could resist her smiles? Whatever resentment I might have held toward that early bird as I dragged my sleepy person down the stairs was dissolved immediately as I responded to the little outstretched arms. The assurance that my baby loved me was heartening. Francora awakened next. Attentive to both, I soon had them in the kitchen, dressed, washed, and ready for their breakfast. All was peace and harmony. There is beauty all around when there's love at home.
I mean,
Well,
she is an incredible writer. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't she? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Always peace and harmony. I was like, from jail, just off the top of your head. Like, old-fashioned fountain pen and ink. In fact, there's an excerpt. You can see her handwriting. I'll try to remember to pull it and put it on Instagram or something. You can see an excerpt of her handwriting. Yeah, it was not all blotch. I mean, I was like, this just flowed right out, huh? Okay. They don't teach us that anymore.
No, they don't.
Or she was really unusually talented. All was peace and harmony until Mrs. Liliencrantz presented herself in the kitchen. I'm not saying that my good lady was the instigator of trouble. But I'm not saying that. No, sorry, that was me again. It just happened that Francora grew peevish and refused to go out and play. The second her mum appeared, fancy that. Okay, so Erna says, busied with household duties, washing, sweeping, dusting, cleaning, etc., I usually left the children pretty much to the care of their mother in the forenoon, although I did assume the responsibility of keeping Mimi, that's Francora, from running away. Yeah, she must have been a handful. Monday was wash day, or rather the big wash day. I washed the children's clothes every day. I can still sense the dull, sluggish headache that forced itself upon me as I hung the clothes on the line. Mimi begged to help me, in scare quotes, so I gave her a few of the handkerchiefs and napkins to carry to the line. But I realized my mistake too late. A moment later, I found them strewn along the garden walk. Of course, this was a little distracting, but I really was more annoyed at myself than at my charge. After all, clean, white napkins and black, moist soil are bound to evoke temptation for a curious 3-year-old. I remember a very similar experience of my own at the age of 2. Freshly clad in a white starched frock, I found myself most susceptible to the lure of a new mud hole. 10 minutes alone in the backyard, and I was wallowing like a little pig in the mire and enjoying it. So Francora was forgiven. Monday afternoon, I amused the babies outside in the backyard. I was always accustomed to playing with them, and so I did today, even if my mind were made up to disengage myself at the end of the month. It was a merry time we had that day. One of our assumed tasks for that afternoon was to christen TT's new birthday baby. After considerable debate and variance of opinion, we finally compromised on Belle, a short name we reasoned would be most fitting as a change from the lengthy titles of Francora's babies Barbara June, Bag Anna, a ragdoll, and Margaret Regina. We lived entirely in the realms of our imaginations that afternoon. First, we played streetcar in the car swing. Then it was hospital with the 4 dolls as our patients. Though the course of our play was all one enigma to little TT, she seemed to enjoy herself immensely, laughing when we laughed and cooing merrily as we chatted. Francora was unusually responsive, and it was more than once that she lightened my somber spirits with the spontaneous, "Oh, aren't we having fun, Erna?" Ooh. Mrs. Liliencrantz, who had been away that afternoon, arrived home about 5 o'clock. It was then that Francora remembered, for the first time since early morning, that she was irritable. The moment that her mother stepped in the door, her attitude toward me veered. She said little, but her little black eyes snapped at me as if I were a boorish intruder. Mrs. Liliencrantz did not fail to observe the child's refractoriness. Her inference, doubtless, was that I had had trouble with her Mimi that afternoon. But how much good does explanation do? Verbosity is often detrimental and always void. I tried my best to keep in good spirits, I know, right?
Verbosity is always what? Whoa.
Verbosity is often detrimental and always void. I wish we were alive and we could have her as a scriptwriter.
Yeah, holy moly.
I tried my best to keep in good spirits as I prepared the children's evening meal, and I did, at least outwardly. But when, an hour or two later, Francora firmly refused to let me undress her and yelled like a maniac when I called her, I made up my mind another time that I was through. To encounter a child who did not voluntarily submit herself to my care was entirely a new experience for me. Never in my life had I coaxed a child, nor was I intending to now. Even if it was sheerly out of independence, I walked away, leaving the little rascal to the mercy of her mother. Honestly, she sounds like a terrible babysitter, and she sounds like I would have been. She sounds terrible and like me. Like, all right, fuck it then, get yourself dressed. It was the first time in my life that I can remember really being outwardly provoked at a child, she says, at the wise old age of 17.
17.
With the prescience that my prestige, whatever little I ever had, was forfeited, I felt like screaming I was going to leave. Yes, quite true. But even then, the thought that I was stung would not be so easy to leave behind. Mrs. Liliencrantz had no reason to accuse me of being too talkative that night. I resumed my work in silence. Not that I held any adverse feelings toward her. In fact, she sought to recover my lacerated spirits with the frequent, "Francora is such a moody child." But it was I who had to bear the brunt of it all. I retreated to my room as soon as the dinner dishes were done, hesitating not even to pick up the paper. Horrid, horrid sensation, that which gripped me on awakening Tuesday morning as the unfruitful results of the previous day surged into my memory. But after taking a brisk cold bath, I went downstairs in a far better humor than when I had mounted them the previous evening. My mind was made up now. I would disclose my plans to Mrs. Liliencrantz and beat it that very day if possible. Life is incessantly holding surprises for us. How often circumstances arise.
I think I know where this is going. Life is...
Yeah, I mean, life hands surprises to us. We hand surprises to life. Who's the actor here? Who can say? Who did what? Who did what?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So life is incessantly just surprises. They pop up.
They do, indeed.
How often circumstances arise and events culminate just opposite from the way we had expected. How often?
Often. Very often.
with these
Mhm.
kind of consequences. Not that often, but yes, often.
Oh.
Yeah, right. It's like, gosh, so interesting how she's writing this from her jail cell, and this is how she's thinking of it in hindsight. She says the law of contrary was most evidently illustrated as I entered the children's bedroom. Francora and I both had a surprise awaiting us that morning. Contrary to my expectations, she seemed unusually submissive and even appealing. Indeed, she had not forgotten the little scene of the night before, but instead of continuing to play her little bad girl role, she did everything within her power to atone for her antics. Furthermore, she was astonished to see me calm, apparently oblivious and even entertaining. If I remember rightly, we played restaurant at breakfast. When Mrs. Liliencrantz came out for breakfast, she found her tots as merry as little larks. T.T. sat in her buggy, busily engaged clapping two lids together, a favourite pastime, while Mims was at the game that she always chose when she was happy, running back and forth from the dining room to the kitchen with frequent, "Erna, what are you doing?" While I would reply in an equally playful tone, "Mimi, what are you doing?" Nor did Francora's attitude change on the appearance of Mrs. Liliencrantz. On the other hand, she was noticeably indifferent to her mother's good morning smile. I must confess that the apathy that she displayed toward her own mother was a balsam to my spirits. I now had sufficient evidence to prove that her periodical tantrums and moods were not personally directed at me. I knew too well that she loved her mother, so this morning I confirmed my lady's ultra-frequent observances. Francora is such a moody child. Noticing that I was unusually busy that morning, Mrs. Liliencrantz proposed to bathe the babies. While T.T. was being ministered to, Francora, desirous again to help, wiped the silver for me. How easily a set mind will be swayed by circumstances. Again, I nearly resolved to try anew. When, half an hour later, I heard bellowing resounding from the bathroom. I was glad. Francora seldom even whimpered when I bathed her, I proudly told myself. The child continued to scream and her mother called me into the bedroom. For some unknown reason, the crying ceased the moment I entered the room, but just as I was feeling proud to be the deliverer, the little vixen commenced her howling again. Between the intermittent, "I want my mama to dress me," it was altogether too plain that Mrs. Liliencrantz and I were making ourselves slaves for the spoiled child. Slaves! Competing for her favour! Bah! It was the last time I was going to let a child make my day miserable. I mean, I wouldn't be so sure about that, actually. Depends how much you like prison. Again, the child was transferred to the arms of her mother at the indulgent, "Oh, she wants to come to her mama, poor little Mimi." That's how I talk to my dogs. To put it mildly, my pride was hurt, and I was about to resign my post right then and there, but for some reason or other, I never produced more than one concise statement. "You're really making it very hard for me, Mrs. Liliencrantz, in not cooperating with me." It was not until later that my lady sallied into the living room, her eyes confirming the irony in her words. "So you're a first-rate disciplinarian, are you?" I saw that she had misconstrued me entirely. The idea of acquiescing to a child's every whim and caprice was what had annoyed me. As to superior disciplinary powers, the thought of such had never entered my mind. Okay, really. Mrs. Liliencrantz, not usually imperious, assumed all the airs of a superior for the remainder of the afternoon. But I was insensible, or rather indifferent to her manner. Whether I pleased or whether I didn't please, I didn't care one iota. I went ahead and worked exactly as I pleased, irrespective of consequences, and at 5 o'clock, as I prepared the children's cereal, I told her that I wished to leave. Well, although she didn't ask for it, I proceeded to make an explanation. "Francora," I told her, "is the first child not to appreciate my care and companionship. And," I continued with growing fervour in my voice, "it's impossible for me to work with any enthusiasm or interest when a child openly dislikes me. Anyway, I feel that the work that you require is a little too strenuous for a girl just 17. Mrs. Liliencrantz made no allusion to the last clause, but as to Francora, she confided, "I believe you are mistaken. With the exception of one girl, Francora likes you better than any girl I ever had." Well, I pity the other girls then. I believe I said this to myself, but this eulogy, if it could be called such, appealed to my pride. In spite of my ostensible apathy, it looked as if she were a bit sorry that I wished to leave, and of course I wanted her to be. Human nature. But when the question of salary arose, I recoiled a bit. If you were to pay for all the things you have broken, I don't believe you'd have a cent coming to you, Mrs. Liliencrantz triumphed. Of course, she was exaggerating tremendously, but I did feel guilty. I had broken a number of little things, and the exasperation lay in the fact that I am not naturally one to break things. Ask my mother. I want to come back to that resume building. She's sort of like, I broke things, but actually I don't even break things, so how wild is that? Like, she can't even own that she, broke the things. It's just interesting. I'm not naturally one to break things. Just ask my mother. Okay. So she says, well, I confessed, I have. But the door was banged in my face, so I thought the rest, and a little more. When Mrs. Liliencrantz emerged from the bedroom, dressed to go out, her entire manner was changed. As I was giving Titi her bottle, she came to me, and in a calm, complacent voice said, well, you will be sweet to my babies anyway, won't you, Erna? And then with a trace of emotion, I know you always are. Oh, yes, I reassured her. It was then that I caught a glint in her eyes that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Not of anger, not of disdain, not of mistrust, but of confidence. Did it touch me? As I led little Mimi to the window a moment later to wave a bye-bye to her mother, I waved too. I had never waved before. So the children were fed and put to bed. As Francora hopped into her little bed, she asked me the question that she loved to ask so often. What makes it get dark? Another time I explained the course of the sun and its relationship to the earth until her wrinkled little forehead relaxed and she exhibited thorough satisfaction. Then I tucked both babies in their little twin beds and left the room. After my own repast, I gazed vacantly out the window for a while, scanned a periodical, and then commenced to do the dishes. It was not until the last pot and pan was in its place and I was shining the stove with a piece of wax paper that a mad alien thought rushed into my mind. Where did it come from? Why? How? I would attempt no conjecture. I know that it remained, and I did not endeavor to get rid of it. Scarcely was the thought born before I was planning to act upon it, and with a half an hour I found myself sitting by Titi's bed writing her a farewell poem. It was while thus engaged that Mrs. Lilienkrantz' mother dropped in to see how the children were. I quickly tucked a sheet of paper in my blouse pocket and rushed to the front hall to welcome her. After scanning through nearly every room in the house and giving me a strong reason to believe that she knew all about my intending to leave, she left. Aha, I laughed to myself, for she doesn't know the half of it. I pulled out my half-formed poem and continued to scribble. A sardonic grin settled on my face as I read and reread the gruesome lines. I could hardly make up my mind whether I was serious or not. Anyway, not once did I feel the pricks of a better nature. I doubt that I have one. My conscience was callous. As soon as the poem was written, I went out and disarranged the kitchen. God only knows the reason for this erroneous procedure. I scattered the oranges about the room, threw out nearly a whole cake and a quantity of salt, inverted the fruit bowl, and was on the verge of breaking some of the dishes, but I at last decided not to be destructive. Oh, mad hour! Where was God? I soon returned to the bedroom, regarded the sleeping children again, stifled a mad variety of thoughts, then chose for my victim the one I loved. More dramatic, I said to myself. I laughed as the scripture came to me. 2 shall be sleeping in a bed, 1 shall be taken and the other left. Little Titi blinked at the light as I carried her gently upstairs. I marveled at my own adeptness as I quickly pulled the towel about her throat. One moment she looked into my eyes and cried. In another moment she was unconscious. I continued to pull, even after she had ceased to writhe, to make certain that she was dead. Still a little doubtful, I slipped a bathing cap over her face and hair. With all air excluded, I reasoned it would be impossible for her to live long. I looked closely to see if she was heaving. Once I imagined that I discerned a little twitch of the hand. Yeah. It was then for the first time that I grew a tiny bit nervous. Recklessly, I pulled the towel tighter and tighter, and then slipped the body between the mattresses. After kneeling on top for 5 or 10 minutes, I left the room. Within 15 minutes, I returned to give the body a final inspection before I phoned the police. There were no doubts now. Only a lifeless mass remained. I phoned to the city hall immediately, and as I awaited the officers in the living room, I took out the little death poem again. At first I had planned to pin it on the baby, but an afterthought prompted me to keep it in my own possession. So I folded the sheet into as small a bulk as possible and slipped it in the back of my cheek where jail matrons would never think to look. Thus I serenely folded my hands and waited for fate to take its course. Signed, Erna Janoschek. Give me your gut response to that.
Holy shit. Like, that's not, I freaked out. I willfully, carefully thought how I would do this and then executed this heinous plan to choose the most innocent babe, and then that she could will herself to inflict that kind of pain and suffering on that small little body. I'm just astounded.
What do you think her motive was?
That is like, that's a great question. I mean,
I know it's just like so hard to
who is she
even put
trying?
yourself in
It's
that.
like, because she's surely smart enough to understand that there will be grave consequences for her. And it's far beyond like not getting any money because you've broken too many things, or
Yeah, it's very
the
permanent, serious.
very permanent. And that's where it's like, yes, this girl was clearly mentally ill. There was clearly something that left her devoid of reason to allow her, this otherwise bright, capable, very well educated for a 17-year-old and very capable individual to then like flip like that and become this. And I'm not a therapist or a psychiatrist, but this
Yeah.
psychotic,
Yeah.
calculating, cold-blooded killer.
To go from a seemingly like competent enough nanny of, who you can trust to look after your kids and not just strangle them with a towel and now you can't.
And where like she chooses the one she loves the most. So she's trying to hurt herself as much as possible, but that also makes no sense. Wow.
Yeah, I thought, is she just super dramatic, right? Like, is this a sign of mental illness, or is this, she says it herself, more dramatic that way. Okay, so police arrested Erna on site, not surprisingly. And during the interrogation, newspaper reporters noted that she was laughing and giggling. Not a reaction that you would typically expect from somebody who just been arrested for murder.
Killed a child.
Yeah. And then she said she was surprised at how little she felt. At one point, she said, I'd rather deal with the police than with Mrs. Liliencrantz because she's a comic. And then she laughed at her own joke. But she said, I do laugh at myself as a coping mechanism to deal with stressful situations, essentially. I do laugh, using laughter as to cope. Again, it's like, is that a bit of insight? Or
terrifying to everyone watching.
Yeah, and apparently the inspector told her this was no laughing matter. And she's like, but I always laugh after I've killed a child. No, when I'm upset. So the next day she went before a judge who remanded her to juvenile hall for a psychiatric evaluation. And the psychiatrists all found that she is indeed a peculiar person, but they all found her sane. They said she knows right from wrong and she understands the consequences of her actions. So she's legally sane. Now, her lawyer was like, you're a minor and I'm a public defender and you need to plead insanity. And she adamantly refused to make the plea. She said insanity was distasteful. She has no intention of claiming it. But essentially, William Shea, her public defender, he was able to enter an insanity plea on her behalf because she's a minor, so he gets to make that call. And she was furious because she said she didn't mind being called a murderess, but she would not be called insane. So obviously, as a 17-year-old girl in trial, whether or not you're insane is like whether or not you get to go to an institution or whether you face the gallows. Like, you could go to prison for the rest of your life, or you could, face the death penalty. The reason so many psychiatrists were involved in this case was because some were angling to use the trial as a platform for sort of to highlight how people who have mental illness weren't being caught until it was, too late. Until
Really
we're
a travesty. Yeah.
Exactly. Because the only threshold for intervention was if you're a danger to life. Okay. And by then it's like too late because somebody's
How do
already
you
dead.
identify that if you're not actively treating mental illness?
Yeah. So this defense psychiatrist, Dr. Richards, was using this case to argue for outpatient facilities and psychotherapy. And this was in the 20s, bear in mind. He's like, we got to have early intervention that can catch these, because there were clearly people who can see warning signs, right? Before we are dealing with a murder case. And that was 1928, which I thought was fairly evolved. In the trial,
yeah.
Erna's mother and sister, they testified in her defense, and they talked about how withdrawn and depressed she had become, and that they did not know how to manage her behaviors, is essentially what they had said. And her mother cried really hard during her testimony, and Erna was really cold and indifferent and sat there shrugging at her mother's pain, apparently. And Edward Janoschek did not bring his religious sorry ass to trial.
He probably didn't even know. Do you think he even knew at that point? Like, if he's off in Salt Lake City, it's not like, in the 1928 that they can just, like, call him up on the telephone.
So when it was time for Erna to testify, apparently she treated the courtroom like a stage. She was a real, scenery chewer, right? Like, she turned to the judge and said, "Do you like my new hat?" And she looked at the jury and then burst out laughing. "Oh, I just can't help it. When I feel the urge to laugh, I just have to give in." She told the story of the murder with no emotion. Imagine being Dr. and Taze Liliencrantz sitting there listening to this.
Listening to how your sweet little baby girl was strangled to death.
Exactly. Now, what came out during the psychiatrist's evaluation was that she had a famous relative, a distant relative, but someone who was genuinely famous, a stage actress back in the early 1900s named Fanny Janoschek. And Erna, it was like her dad's cousin or something. And so Erna knew this connection, this familial connection, and she decided that meant that she was destined for fame. Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh on LA Not So Confidential podcast suggest that Erna having this belief that she was destined for fame because of her famous relative, it might be that as she sees the Liliencrantz like moving in social circles and having access and money, Erna had these deep-seated delusions of grandeur, and coupled with a deep-seated sense of inferiority. And so when you put those together, you end up with sort of a jealousy and revenge and grievance collecting, right? Like, people feeling slighted because they imagine that what that person has should be theirs. So that's the sort of where they landed. All the psychiatrists on both sides found her sane, and the jury found her guilty of murder in the first degree. The Judge Wood, sentenced her to life in prison. He said it's willful, premeditated murder done after reflection, as you said, Jess. She went to San Quentin in California and immediately made herself the most difficult person in the building. She refused to call other prisoners by their names, and instead she addressed them by their crimes, like, hi, Mrs. Grand Larceny, how are you today? Hi, petty theft. Like, Mrs. Involuntary Confinement. Like whatever they were in for. She looked down on them. She said, basically, she didn't care to associate with the other people, that they weren't on her caliber. The idea of a mere drunk and disorderly assuming equality with a real murderess, that was a direct quote from On the Record to a newspaper reporter.
Wow.
She caused so many issues. She broke windows. She kicked over the prison Christmas tree. She attacked the matron. She set a bed on fire. She attempted to end her own life at least twice by cutting her wrists. And at this point, the prison psychiatrists were needing to keep her and others safe. And the diagnosis that she got is basically schizophrenia. Okay, so their assessment says she's moody, sullen, depressed, and subject to outbreaks of dangerous character, both homicidal and insanitary. So after the judge reviewed her case, he said he couldn't reverse her sentence, but it was like, well, despite what the psychiatrist said, actually she is insane. And she was sent to the California State Mental Hospital. And the judge said to her, Erna, wouldn't you rather know that you can be cured in hospital? And she said, I don't care anymore what will become of me. So she did undergo some kind of surgery, which we can speculate that because it was 1929, and we know that it was a surgery that she underwent in the hospital and it was related to her mental state, that it was probably a lobotomy. So whatever they did after that surgery, her behavior changed. She stopped acting out, right? She was no longer kicking over the prison Christmas tree and breaking windows and appearing in newspapers. She was returned from the mental institution to San Quentin, and she was probably much more pleasant to be around because she was no longer attacking her cellmates and calling them names, but she also began to write poetry and earned herself a name as the prison poet, so maybe she wasn't any easier to be around. She wrote letters to her estranged father, and she told Edward that when she got out she wanted to be a writer. Edward at some point came to Oakland and purchased a typewriter for her. It says that in the paper that he arranged for the clerk to mail it to her at San Quentin. Before he walked out, he told the clerk, I'm her father, and then he walked away. Apparently.
So did she die in prison, or?
She did not. She first applied for parole in 1935. It was denied. She hadn't served the minimum of 10 years that I guess her life sentence had a 10-year minimum. She applied again 2 years later in 1937. She was denied. And then in 1940, I'm just thinking she went away in 1928, right? Yeah. She was released on lifetime probation, so she served 12 years. Yeah, she sort of really faded into obscurity for somebody who had, as a teenager, just out of the blue, killed an innocent child. She did change her name and settled somewhere in Northern California, but it appears that she lived an ordinary life. We know that she died in 2007 at 95.
Wow.
Her mum died.
That's so unfair. That's so, I feel terrible saying that, but
Yeah.
for that crime, with that calculation, with no remorse, that she was able to walk out of prison and then just change her name and have a new life and live and breathe and enjoy everything Northern California has to offer, while this 1-year-old child got none of that.
Yeah.
That just,
yeah.
oh God, it makes me sick.
There is no justice, obviously. This is, why I was kind of interested in. It seems that Edward Janoschek had schizophrenia. It seems that Erna did too. I have questions about somebody who just, like Edward, who becomes so fanatically engaged in their religion that, what does that say about a person's mental health? I will tell you.
Does a lobotomy, I don't know, does it effectively treat schizophrenia, or did she just become clever enough to mask it and present that part of her that could fool people into thinking she was better and she was a different person?
Well, exactly.
Oh no,
There's so much unknown. Just thinking about her upbringing. So she's got something from her dad side. But
yeah, the grandiosity, I am the one that has to go and proselytize everywhere for the church. Only me, only I can do this. Yeah.
Yeah, and then look at the family system as well. Like Dr. Scott says, if your faith is so strong that you neglect your family and abandon them, because you're called by God to do so, that's going to cause some notable issues
Well,
that will
yeah.
arise
I
in
mean,
your family from that. That's like
she
internal
and
family systems 101. You
her
abandoned
mom
your
and
kid.
her sister knew. Yeah, he loved the church more than them.
Yes,
They weren't even a, like, blink of his eye. He had no obligation, no investment, nothing.
exactly. And here are these forensic psychologists who they're not LDS or, they knew nothing about the family systems of Mormonism. And I was like, but they're also seeing very clearly some, like the damage that was done
Right.
in these families. And it's intergenerational. So the damage done in one generation is the gift it keeps on giving.
Yeah,
And,
it's
so,
true.
okay, so I will just wrap up on everyone else and I'll let you know what became of them all real quick. Grace, her sister, who testified in her defense, she became a teacher like her mother and she married a Harvard graduate and she died in 1984. Francora, little Francora, grew up as an only child and hopefully had a wonderful life and died in 2014. So, in closing, for the benediction, Jess, I was thinking, those letters that Edward Janoschek wrote to the first presidency, asking permission to get married at 39, and they wrote, "Give him 1 year together." Actually, Edward spent the next 2.5 decades, like moving his family wherever the church required, abandoning them to fulfill whatever church calling that he was asked to, leaving Maria to raise 2 children on her salary, Erna going to work when she's 17, Grace was covering the bills when she was in college, apparently. So I just want to say that a psychiatrist in 1928 can stand up in a courtroom and look at a system that produces something like this and says, right, like, we need a way to catch people before they
Yeah.
become a case. And he's right. And there are many ways and interventions to do that. By the time, you're looking, it might be too late. But the church gave Edward a mission and a title and a cause bigger than his family and the love that he had for his family. And then his family was left to manage his consequences. And, the result is we have this horrendous case of a dead baby and Edward in Salt Lake City doing his thing.
It is terrific. And that's a really interesting angle that if only, like, right, if only those psychiatrists who evaluated her had access to the implications of that family dynamic and what was going on in terms of the neglect, for his family, for his children, in favor of nourishing something bigger than him that eventually, cast him aside for criticizing it. But,
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over again, something that came back to me is like she had vengeance, right? She had reasons for vengeance. I have been put
Mm-hmm.
aside over and over and over again. I am the victim here, and so I will
Yeah.
reap my reward.
Right. Because people who end up with that kind of mentality, it doesn't mean that real harm hasn't been done to her, because clearly it was, right? Like,
Right.
that is not your father abandoned you and was never available, and goodness knows what it looked like when he was there. And yeah, it was due to this. Religion plays a big role in this case. Interestingly enough, it was just
Yeah.
a
Well, and
random one that I stumbled across from a
with an
long
active
time ago.
Mormon mother, if presumably, she's been taught her whole life that her role is to be the subservient helpmeet and not have desires and interests of her own, that her role in life is to serve others. And then she finds herself in that situation and is like, no, thanks. I don't,
Right.
but to a much more grievous end than, I'm going to leave and go to college instead.
And sorry to make just this so obvious parallel, but the idea of Marie working while her husband is just like got his head up his arse with his religious fanatical pursuits. It's so Tammy and Chad Daybell, right? Tammy
Mm.
working to hold down their family, being the being the main provider, right? The majority provider, and Chad earning about 12,000 a year doing
Oh,
nonsense,
that's gross.
right? It's like, it just reminds me of that dynamic where the woman is like, okay, and raise the kids and go make the money too. Okay. All right. I'll just do it all, shall I?
Do it, right? I mean, that's my role, right? I'm the
Yeah.
mother. The
Yeah.
mother.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I thought I was supposed to be the mother and you were supposed to be the provider, but I'll just assume both.
Do it all.
Yeah. Very, very much that. Well, that is a great and wholesome highlight to leave everybody on. Thank you so much for listening
Hannah, that
today.
was a perfect bedtime story. I'm sure I'll sleep well.
You're welcome.
If I sleep at all.
But
Yeah, I gotta thank everybody for being here and for listening. We are slowly but surely building our own eternal family. And if this story was interesting to you and you found something that landed, thinking about what happens to someone's psyche when they're abandoned and traded for love of the gospel, come back next week. We'll have something interesting for you to hear. Hannah, I gotta say, like, the people that have supported us in this journey, I'm really grateful for. And Hannah W, especially for our amazing theme song, and Dave for the guitar, and for Mick for doing everything he can to make us sound professional. Super grateful to them. Big shout out.
so grateful to our beautiful theme song providers. Hey, Jess, one more thing. I am sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon too.